There's a silence that doesn't come from peace. It's the kind that settles between two people who once looked at each other and felt alive, but now share only the air, not the breath. A silence that feels heavier than words because it carries the weight of everything that's no longer spoken. You can be sitting across from someone at the dinner table, hear the clinking of cutlery, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of your own breath, and still you feel utterly alone. Erich Fromm once wrote that mature love is about giving and becoming, not about possessing. But somewhere along the way, many relationships lose that essence. What once was an open field of discovery becomes a closed room without windows. Not because love has simply faded, but because something inside one or both partners has stopped growing. And when growth stops, the soul begins to look for cracks, places where it can breathe again. Sometimes that search takes the form of betrayal, not as a chase for pleasure, but as a desperate response to a quiet erosion that began long before the act itself.
This is not about blaming or excusing. It's about looking deeper than the surface of the wound. Because every act of infidelity has two layers, the visible and the unseen. And the unseen is often a silent cry, a search for the self that got lost inside the walls of the relationship. If we dare to look at it without fear, without judgment, we might find that the story of betrayal begins not in someone else's arms, but in the quiet spaces where we abandoned our own truth. Sometimes, the departure isn't away from the person lying beside you. It's away from the person you've become in their presence. You wake up one day and realize that the face in the mirror is no longer yours. The laugh feels rehearsed. The words that leave your mouth sound like they belong to someone else. Someone shaped by expectations, compromises, and silent agreements you never truly consented to. In the beginning, love often feels like expansion. You grow into new habits, new roles, new dreams. But slowly, almost invisibly, that expansion can become a narrowing. The we that once felt like freedom turns into a cage you decorate so well you forget it has bars. Until one day, you can no longer ignore the ache in your chest. The one that whispers that somewhere along the way, you traded your own voice for harmony, your own needs for peace. Carl Jung spoke of the tension between the real self and the social self. When the social self, the mask you wear to keep the relationship intact, becomes too heavy, the real self begins to retreat underground. And when it retreats for too long, it doesn't come back quietly. It erupts, often in ways that look destructive from the outside, but feel like survival from the inside. Infidelity, in this light, is less about leaving someone else, and more about trying to return to the parts of yourself you fear are gone forever.
It's a return that's rarely clean, rarely kind, and rarely conscious. But beneath it, there's almost always a longing, not simply for another person, but for the freedom to be, once again, entirely and unapologetically you. We are taught to think of desire as a hunger, a sign of something missing, an emptiness calling to be filled. But not all desire is born from absence. Sometimes, it comes from a place of overflowing, a quiet force that wants to expand beyond the edges of the life it knows. It is less a plea for rescue and more a declaration. I am still here, and I am more than what this moment allows me to be.
In the context of infidelity, especially within women's inner landscapes, this can be misunderstood. It's easy to label it as a simple craving for newness or excitement. But for some, it is about reclaiming a territory that has been silently taken. The right to own one's body, one's pleasure, one's choices, without them being filtered through someone else's expectations. It is an act, conscious or not, of stepping back into authorship of one's own life. Nietzsche spoke of the will to power, not in the sense of domination over others, but as the innate drive to expand, to grow, to create meaning from within. Applied to relationships, this can manifest as a refusal to stay contained within a version of oneself that feels diminished. Sometimes it bursts out in the form of an affair, not because the person sought another lover, but because they sought the part of themselves that had been quietly suffocating. Desire, in this sense, is not the sign of a wound to be healed, but a pulse of vitality that refuses to be silenced. It is the body and soul conspiring to remind you that you are more than the roles you play, more than the patterns you maintain, more than the peace you preserve at the cost of your own fire. There is a kind of quiet that doesn't comfort. It numbs. It seeps into the spaces between two people when the days begin to blur, when each morning feels like a repetition of the last, when every conversation is a variation of the same safe phrases. It is not the absence of love, but the absence of surprise. And over time, that absence can feel like a slow erosion of the soul. Neuroscience tells us that dopamine, the brain's signal of aliveness, responds most intensely not to pleasure itself, but to novelty. A familiar touch can be warm, grounding, and safe, yet still fail to stir that deep current of anticipation the mind craves. And when a relationship becomes predictable, the brain quietly begins to wander, seeking the spark that once made life feel electric. Schopenhauer warned that life moves between suffering and boredom. When suffering subsides, boredom waits at the door, pressing against the walls of even the most stable bonds. This doesn't mean that stability is the enemy, but stability without renewal becomes a kind of emotional drought. The soul, much like the body, cannot thrive in drought for long. In that dryness, even the faintest sign of rain, an unexpected glance, an unplanned encounter, a conversation that stirs forgotten emotions, can feel intoxicating. It is not always the person themselves that draws someone in, but the way they awaken dormant parts of the self. And so, what appears to be a betrayal may in truth be an attempt, however misguided, to escape the gray monotony that has quietly replaced the vivid colors of connection. Some stories do not begin in adulthood. They begin in the quiet corridors of childhood, in rooms where love was present but conditional, or absent in ways too subtle to name. A child learns, often without realizing, that connection can be unpredictable, that warmth can vanish without warning, that approval must be earned, that safety may depend on silencing parts of themselves. These early experiences do not simply fade with time. They imprint themselves into the nervous system, shaping the way we seek and hold love. In adulthood, this can take the form of an unconscious repetition, searching for or recreating relationships that mirror the instability we once knew. It is not sabotage in the deliberate sense, but a deep, almost invisible pull toward what is familiar, even if it hurts. Gabor Mate often speaks of how we seek relief from unspoken pain in ways that feel soothing in the moment, but carry their own consequences. In this light, an affair can be less about the new person and more about a reenactment, a chance, however unconscious, to rewrite an old emotional script. Yet, instead of rewriting it, we often find ourselves repeating it, because the underlying wound remains unacknowledged. When attachment wounds meet the inherited patterns of family or culture, the weight becomes heavier still. Generations can pass down unspoken lessons about love, lessons shaped by absence, sacrifice, betrayal, or silence. To break from them requires not just awareness, but the courage to step into the unknown, where love is no longer dictated by history, but shaped by a new and conscious choice. There is a particular kind of loneliness that is felt most sharply in the presence of another. It is the loneliness of speaking and not being heard, of showing yourself and finding no reflection in the other's eyes. Over time, this absence of recognition can feel like an erosion, not sudden, but slow, as though parts of you are quietly dissolving in the background of everyday life. When someone else notices you, really notices you, it can feel like oxygen rushing into a room that had long been closed. Their gaze, their attention, their interest becomes a mirror, one that reflects back a version of you that feels alive, desirable, seen. In psychology, this is sometimes called a narcissistic mirror, not in the sense of vanity, but in the way it temporarily restores a fractured sense of self. Yet mirrors like this are dangerous. They can become addictive, not because of who stands in front of them, but because of what they seem to give back to you. The more invisible you have felt, the more magnetic that reflection becomes. And so, the betrayal may not be driven primarily by a yearning for someone else, but by a craving for the self that only appears in their presence. But such reflections are fragile. They depend on external light. And when that light shifts or fades, the old invisibility can return, often deeper than before. The true hunger, then, is not for another person's gaze, but for a way of being seen that does not disappear when they turn away. It is easy to see an affair and assume it was driven by physical desire alone. Our culture often frames infidelity as a failure of restraint, a surrender to lust. But the reality, in many cases, is far more complex. For many women, the act is less about the body and more about the soul, less about pleasure and more about an ache that words have never managed to express. Sex can be part of it, yes, but beneath it, there is often a hunger for connection that goes beyond touch. A hunger to be met emotionally, to be understood without having to explain, to be held in a presence that feels awake and engaged. When this kind of connection is missing, even the most faithful heart can begin to wander, not toward a body, but toward the possibility of being deeply felt by another human being. The difference between betraying for desire and betraying for psychic necessity is profound. Desire might be a spark, an impulse that comes and goes. Psychic necessity is different. It is born from a long winter of emotional starvation. In that state, even a fleeting moment of intimacy can feel like a lifeline, and yet, meeting that need in secret rarely resolves the deeper hunger. It may soothe it for a while, but without addressing the absence at its core, the emptiness inevitably returns. The act, then, is less a resolution and more a signal, a sign that something essential has been missing for far too long. In Jungian thought, the persona is the mask we present to the world, the version of ourselves shaped to be accepted, to keep the peace, to fulfill the roles we believe are required of us. In intimate relationships, this mask can become both armor and prison. Over time, as routines deepen and identities become entangled, the persona can grow heavy, concealing aspects of the self that once moved freely in the light. When those hidden parts finally find a crack through which to breathe, they often emerge with an intensity that surprises even the person experiencing it. An affair can sometimes act as that crack, a space, however fleeting, where long-suppressed qualities are awakened. Confidence, curiosity, playfulness, sensuality, parts of the self-thought lost return with unexpected force. It feels like a resurrection, not of the relationship, but of an inner life that had gone quiet. This is why such encounters can feel disproportionately powerful. They are not only about the other person involved, they are about the version of yourself you become in their presence. The energy, the lightness, the sense of possibility. It all carries the intoxication of rediscovery. And yet, this resurrection is often temporary because it is built on external circumstances rather than an inner transformation. The real question is whether these reawakened parts can be integrated into daily life, outside of secrecy and rupture. Without that integration, the mask will eventually return, and the cycle of suppression, eruption, and longing will quietly begin again. There is a kind of emptiness that has nothing to do with the absence of love, money, or success. It is quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to name. It's the space between what life is and what it could be, the gap between existing and truly living. In a relationship, this void can grow silently, fed by routine, by unspoken compromises, by the gradual fading of curiosity. Schopenhauer described life as oscillating between suffering and boredom. In love, boredom is rarely about the other person's worth. It is about the mind's desperate attempt to escape the weight of sameness. The days begin to blur, the heart begins to slow, and a subtle sense of pointlessness seeps into every interaction. In this state, the mind doesn't necessarily seek joy. It seeks rupture, anything to break the inertia. This is why certain encounters can feel so disproportionately significant. They are not just moments of excitement. They are moments where the void seems, for an instant, to dissolve. The colors sharpen. The air feels different. You feel different. And in that shift, it becomes easy to mistake the person for the source of the awakening, when in truth, they are only the spark. The real fire was always waiting inside you, buried under the weight of the ordinary. Yet sparks, by nature, are fleeting. And when they fade, the void can return, sometimes even larger than before. The deeper work is not in chasing the next spark, but in facing the emptiness itself, understanding what it's asking of you, and finding ways to fill life with meaning that don't depend on chance disruptions. Every relationship carries an unspoken agreement, a fragile web of trust, attention, and presence. It is not written or signed, but lived in the daily gestures, the glances that linger, the willingness to truly listen. When this pact is intact, even in moments of conflict, there is a thread that holds two people together. But when it begins to fray, the unraveling is often slow, almost imperceptible. Betrayal rarely begins with the touch of another. It begins in the small daily abandonments. When curiosity fades, when conversations shrink to logistics, when eyes pass over each other without stopping. It begins in the moments when one partner turns away emotionally, when the silent pull toward other worlds grows stronger than the pull toward each other. Emotional and energetic infidelity often precedes the physical. It can be a thought that lingers too long, a connection that feels harmless, but quietly becomes a refuge, a space where one feels more alive than at home. These are the moments when the pact is already cracking, when the soul has already stepped outside, even if the body remains. By the time the physical act happens, the deeper rupture has long since occurred. The act becomes the visible proof of something that had been breaking, piece by piece, in silence. And in that sense, the real betrayal is not only in crossing a line with another person, but in the quiet, repeated choice to stop showing up for the relationship long before that line was crossed. For some, the breaking point becomes a doorway. The shock of what has happened, whether they were the one who stepped outside or the one left behind, forces a confrontation with truths that had been avoided for years. In that confrontation, there is pain, but there is also potential. The betrayal becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the fractures in the relationship, but the fractures within the self. In these rare cases, the crisis becomes a catalyst for deep reconstruction. The person begins to ask questions they had long silenced. Who am I when I'm not performing for others? What do I truly need to feel alive? What patterns have I carried that no longer serve me? This kind of awakening does not erase the harm done, but it can lead to a more honest, grounded, and conscious way of living, both with oneself and with others. For others, however, the cycle simply repeats. The affair is treated as the problem rather than the symptom, and the underlying emptiness is left untouched. In this pattern, the relief found in the affair fades and the hunger returns, leading to new repetitions of the same dynamic. Without the courage to face the inner void, betrayal remains not a teacher, but a recurring escape. The difference between transformation and repetition lies in whether the pain is used as a doorway or avoided as a burden. Both paths begin in the same place, a rupture that shakes the ground beneath you. But one path leads inward, into the shadow and toward integration. The other circles back to the same unfulfilled search, where the scenery changes but the ache remains the same. The human brain is not a fixed landscape. It is shaped, reshaped, and reshaped again by the emotional patterns it repeats. Every experience of connection and every experience of disconnection leaves an imprint, a pathway the mind learns to follow almost without thought. Over years, these pathways can become so familiar that they feel inevitable, as if our emotional lives were destined to move in circles. Neuroscience tells us that these patterns can be rewritten. But rewriting does not happen through denial or erasure. It happens through awareness and new experiences that speak to the same depths where the old wounds were formed. When betrayal occurs, the instinct is often to see it only as an ending. Yet, in the map of the mind, it can also be an opening, a chance to see, perhaps for the first time, the labyrinth of unmet needs, unspoken fears, and unhealed memories that has been guiding the way. This is why, at its core, betrayal is less about the physical act and more about the emotional architecture beneath it. The affair, the secrecy, the rupture, these are only the visible cracks. The real story is written in the spaces where intimacy broke long before. And those spaces, if faced with honesty, can become the ground where something new is built. Not every relationship survives. Not every bond can be repaired. But every person, no matter the shape of the ending, can choose to meet themselves differently on the other side. Because beneath the pain, beneath the anger, beneath the loss, there is still the possibility of a return. Not to the past, but to the self that has been waiting all along. If something in these words echoed in you, if you recognized yourself in the silences, the patterns, or the longings, let this be the moment you pause. Not to rush into fixing, not to chase quick answers, but to truly listen to what your own life has been trying to tell you. This channel exists as a space for that kind of listening. A place to explore the hidden architecture of your emotions, the weight of your unspoken stories, and the possibilities that come when you stop living only on the surface. If you want to walk further into these questions with me, to understand not just the what of your life, but the why beneath it, you can be part of this journey. Subscribe, so each new reflection can find you when you need it most. Share this video with someone who may be carrying the same silent questions. And if you feel moved, leave your own reflections below. Your words may become the mirror someone else has been searching for. Because here, it's not about quick fixes or easy truths. It's about the slow, deliberate work of returning to your essence, to your freedom, and to the life that still waits for you beyond the roles you've been taught to play.